Welcome to the new Understanding Unreal series. This is episode 1, and if you want to find out what the series is going to go over, check out the iCard where we have the overview of what we'll be doing. Our objectives will be to create the project and import our basic assets we'll start with. We'll set up our inputs, and we'll create our game mode, character controller, and HUD class. I'm kind of condensing this into a smaller episode of just these simple things because most people will already have this done and in a way that they want, but this is really, of course, for people that don't have it and want to see everything how I do it from the start. So this won't be too much configuration. This is just basic setup for inputs and characters, seeing how to import assets from the marketplace as well. Let's start by creating our project. I'm using the latest version of Unreal Engine, which is 5.4.3. All of this should look the same for you, but if anything doesn't, check latest documentation, and I'll constantly refer to that as well. We're going to create a new blank project. We will be diving into C++ in the future, and we'll show how to convert to that, but we'll start with Blueprint on desktop, maximum. Starter content is enabled, and throw ray tracing on there if you'd like. This really doesn't matter. I'm just going to have this in here for default for other tutorials, but if you don't want ray tracing, then leave it unchecked. Pick your project location and the name of your project, and select Create. Once it finishes, this is what you'll see. This is one reason I picked the empty project, is because it comes with a landscape. The original Unreal Engine 4 project that was empty did not come with this and just came with some other stuff. And I kind of like just having a nice world partitioned landscape to play around with, and it's a good little demo space. Most people would think that I would start with the first person or third person content, which is actually very easily importable by clicking add feature or content pack, and then you can bring in any template that you would like. While we won't be doing that at this point, we will be adding the asset packs that we mentioned in the intro video to this project. Once you've added that content, you should be able to come into your content browser and see what we've added here. Now I'm going to set up the majority of our inputs. I may leave out a few just so that way we can reference them in future tutorials, but this is going to be the majority of our inputs. I'm going to fast forward this just a little bit, but not so fast that you can't see what I'm doing. It is just a slow, tedious process that you kind of have to get done. So I'll walk through the first few steps with you on how I will do action mappings and axis mappings. We will address enhanced input mappings in the future, but currently we're just going to stick with the default input system. You can see that my project already has the project settings tab open, but if you don't see that, go to edit, come down to project settings, and for the input, we'll come down to input over on the side here under engine, and we've got absolutely nothing. Now it's going to give us a message that axis and action mappings are now deprecated. Please use enhanced input actions and input mapping contexts instead. Now this is accurate, and this is a much better way to handle most action and access mappings, but this is still a valid way, and it's a simpler way to start with understanding, though the much more robust enhanced input actions and mapping contexts are what we will be moving to in the future. Let's start with axis mappings. These are going to be things like our mouse that we will gather data from continuously. This will also include movement inputs because controllers do have gradual input that they can feed with, even though most keyboards don't have pressure-sensitive keys. This will set up our forward and backward, which gives us an alpha of 1 or -1 based off of W and S. We'll do the same thing for left and right here. Here we've got move right, which indicates A being the leftmost key as a negative value and D being rightmost key as a positive value. You could of course make this move left if you wanted it hierarchically to be 1 and -1 or vice versa and switch these, but I just did it alphabetically, even though I didn't do these, but just kind of copying over from a previous system I had. At the end of the day, whatever is readable and makes sense, so that way other people working on it can understand what's going on, is going to be the best way that you and your team can make this. I'm going to finish out the mouse movement and move on to action mappings. Now let's move on to action mappings. These are mappings that mainly need to be understood once, whether they're on or off, being triggered or not triggered. Our first example of this will be jump. You don't need to know if the person is holding it or not holding it through the consecutiveness of the jump. You can just control how the jump is calculated and maintained as to whether it receives a pressed or released action. I'm going to finish setting up the input actions that we need, and we'll move on to creating our blueprints. Now that we have our input set up, let's create our core classes. Let's go into our content drawer, and in the main content folder, create a new folder called core. This is where we'll keep our game mode, game state, player state master, player controller master, and our character master classes. Let's create all of these. First, let's create our game mode. Now we can create our character master and our character controller master. While we're at it, let's make a HUD class. And a player state master. Now, best practice is with most blueprints, you would prefix them all with BP underscore. But these are all classes that are going to mainly have one place they can go, and we know where they'll go, and they're not going to change. And B, we also know that these are our master classes and not someone else's. So honestly, we don't have to designate them as blueprints since we already know that's exactly what they are. As for a general rule of thumb though, we will be using most proper best practice when prefixing and suffixing new assets, like BP underscore for new blueprints, T underscore for new textures, M underscore and MI underscore for new materials and material instances, and etc. One thing I will do real quick is call this UU for Understanding Unreal Game Mode Master, just to designate it a little separately, even though other things may be called player states, HUDs, whatnot. I just want this one to look a little separate up here because all the other game mode overrides are, well, they start with game mode basically. And we will want to set this here. If you don't have a world settings panel, you can come to settings and select world settings and pop this over here if it's just floating. And then scroll down to game mode and then set your game mode to what we just created. Now we can set these defaults to the assets we just created. And to confirm that they replicated properly to the asset, we can open them up and see that everything has changed properly. Now, if you hit Control-Shift-S, this will save your whole project. And if it wants you to save your untitled level, just like it does for me, feel free to go into your starter content maps and save it as whatever you would like. I know this is called the open world map, so I'm going to name it as such. I want to talk real briefly about the differences between these blueprints and what we will be using them for. The character master blueprint, or our character blueprint, is where we will store the model, have its animations, and specific logic to that character or that version of that character. A lot of generic logic can be handled in the player controller class, like input and some other generic things like health, depending on how you want them to be handled. Many people choose to handle health and other things like that through components, which is very wise, and we will be doing some component-based handling of those kind of systems. But feel free to handle most generic things that all controllable characters can do in your master blueprint for the controller. You can make children of these override functions, so some things are in there or not, but feel free to throw most input functions and generic functions like that that aren't specific to a character in here. The HUD is going to be for initializing our UI, controlling a lot of that, and instancing it per the controller to our character blueprint, which we'll address in the future. And the player state's really useful for some multiplayer things that we'll handle, and also kind of game state, player state stuff. It's much easier to explain in the moment with an example, so we will get around to that. And of course, this just designates the rules of the game mode. What are we going to use? Which controller, which character, and things like that. We've already set that up, and if you need a deeper dive into that, there is some documentation and videos explaining why this is handled that way. These are just the first steps. We can hit Control P to start playing, but it really won't do much as the character and everything we have doesn't really, well, do much. We've got no camera, we've got no movements. All of those inputs that we've set up do a whole lot of nothing. And of course, we just get a bunch of landscape errors, no camera, no visuals. So this is something that we'll have to address in the next episode. We will create our character, so stick around for that.